Good afternoon. I'm Jeanne Marsh, the Dean of the School of Social Service Administration, and it's my very great pleasure to introduce to you today the leading highlight of our Centennial launch celebration today, a lecture by Dr. William Schultz. William Schultz, according to the New York Review of Books, has done more than anyone in American human rights movement to make human rights issues known in the U.S. From the refugee camps of Darfur, Sudan, to the poorest villages in India, from prison cells of Monrovia, Liberia, to the business suites of Hong Kong, to Louisiana's death row, Dr. William F. Schultz has traveled the globe in pursuit of a world free from human rights violations. As Executive Director of Amnesty International USA from 1994 to 2006, he headed the American section of the world's oldest and largest international human rights organization. Dr. Schultz is currently a senior fellow at the Center for American Progress in Washington, D.C., where he works in the areas of human rights policy and religion and public policy, and holds appointments as an adjunct professor of public administration at the Wagner School of New York University and an affiliated professor of our own Meadville Lombard Theological School here at the University of Chicago. He is or has been a consultant to many institutions and foundations, including the UN Foundation, Humanity United, and Simmons College in Boston. During 2006-07, he served as a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at Harvard School of Government. He has traveled tens of thousands of miles in the United States, spreading the human rights message from campus to boardrooms to civic organization, a frequent guest on television programs such as Good Morning America, The Today Show, Hardball, and Nightline. He's the author of 2 books on human rights, In Our Own Best Interest, How Defending Human Rights Benefits Us All, and Tainted Legacy, 9/11 and the Ruin of Human Rights. He's a contributing editor of The Phenomenon of Torture, Readings and Commentary, and The Future of Human Rights, U.S. Policy for a New Era. An ordained Unitarian Universalist minister, Dr. Schultz came to Amnesty after serving for 15 years with the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, the UUA, the last 8, 1985 to 93, as president. As president, he led the first visit by a U.S. member of Congress to post-revolutionary Romania in January 1991, 2 weeks after the fall of the Nikolai Ceausescu, thank you. That delegation was instrumental in the subsequent improvement in the rights of religion and ethnic minorities in Romania. There is more information about Dr. Schultz's extremely important and interesting career, but I think it would be best if I let him speak for himself. Please join me in welcoming Dr. William Schultz.
Well, Dean Marsh, thank you very much, and it's a delight to be with you today. And I see you all think you're in church because you've left the front pews vacant. Whenever that happens, I always think of a story that we used to tell one another when I was in theological school down the block here at 57th and Woodlawn about the parishioner who snuck into the back of the church in the middle of the sermon and whispered to one of the other communicants, how long has he been preaching? Pointing to the preacher. And the other parishioner said, 25 or 30 years. And the attorney parishioner said, well, I guess I'll stay. He'll surely be done soon. So I feel right at home with you all in the back pews. You know, this is a centennial, and I therefore did a little research on 1908. And the fact is that 1908 was not unequivocally a good year. Bosnia-Herzegovina, for example, was annexed by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which would lead directly, 6 years later, to World War I. An earthquake devastated Messina, Sicily, killing 100,000 people. The 16th Amendment to the Constitution was adopted, authorizing the federal government to collect income tax. And in light of all that, perhaps it was appropriate that SOS became the standard distress symbol in 1908. And paradoxically enough, confusion about women's roles was nicely captured that year. For 1908 was both the first year that Mother's Day was celebrated and the first year that a female beauty pageant was ever held. But the year was not without its highlights. For one thing, the 17th Amendment to the Constitution was also adopted. That's the one that requires the direct election of senators, and I doubt if Barack Obama would ever have made it to the Senate, much less the presidency, without that modest bit of constitutional reform. And of course, 1908 was the year that William Howard Taft was elected president. I love William Howard Taft, not because of his political views, which were retrogressive, but because of his sense of humor. Taft, as you know, was a very large man. He was pushing 350 pounds. And apparently, he was once introduced at a political gathering by Chauncey Depew, who was a great hotel magnate of that era. And Depew, in welcoming the president, said, "Ladies and gentlemen, the truth is that President Taft is pregnant." And when Taft got up to speak, he played along with the gag. He said, "Yes, it's true, I am pregnant, and if it is a boy, we will name it after me. And if it is a girl, we will name it after my wife, Helen. But if, as I suspect, it is nothing but a bag of wind, we will name it Chauncey Depew." I like his sense of humor. And actually, what nice symmetry it is that in 1908, America elected its heaviest president, and 100 years later, its slimmest, except for perhaps James Madison, who I think weighed about 98 pounds. But of course, what was the most significant event of 1908? Come on now, the founding of the School of Social Service Administration. And I'm really delighted to have been asked to participate in this commemorative occasion. With my Unitarian Universalist hat on, I of course claim Jane Addams as a Unitarian, and Martha Sharp, the chair of the co-founder of the Unitarian Universalist Service Committee, of which I'm currently chair of the board, studied at this school in the 1930s, and it was the inspiration of this school that led to her work in Eastern Europe in the early era, in the early part of the Nazi era. Moreover, of course, the social service sector and the human rights community have a great deal in common. For one thing, we both have to navigate the politics of rescue, be it rescue of individual sufferers. That was often the case, of course, in my work at Amnesty International, or rescue of a society at large, or even rescue of our ideals from the lurch of despond. And the dynamic, as you well know, who are in this field, the dynamic between the rescuer and the one being rescued is a tricky one. On the one hand, the one who is rescued, and even in the use of that word, you feel some hesitation, some reticence. That person can be enormously grateful for the relief of her torment. Certainly that was true of victims of human rights violations who had experienced torture or unfair, unjust imprisonment, often expressed that gratitude liberally to whoever she believed was responsible for relief. And such a reaction is entirely natural, but it reflects a differential in power between rescuer and the rescued one that can eventually shade into resentment on the part of the latter. And of course, from the point of view of the person doing the rescuing, certainly in human rights work, the danger in a successful rescue is not that kind of resentment about a differential of power. It's rather a problematic of pride. Look what I've accomplished, we've accomplished. We've saved the kingdom from the forces of evil. And pride entices us not only to think we know all the answers, but to be supremely irritated with all those other people who think that they do too. Indeed, I suspect that few emotions are more common among people who work for a more just society than anger. And it makes sense, of course, that we would be angry at conditions in society, greed, racism, violence, that guarantee inequities in the allocation of power and make impossible a fair distribution of the earth's abundance. But I'm talking about another kind of anger that appears too often, an anger so pervasive that it targets not just the oppressors, but our would-be allies who may see a problem differently. A kind of anger that precludes admitting that our opponents retain even a hint of a common humanity. A kind of anger that makes righteousness, mistakes righteousness for being right. I will never forget, for example, one Sunday morning listening to a preacher, his face red with rage, pounding the pulpit as he commanded his parishioners to be gentle with one another. And along with anger, of course, comes guilt. Guilt that we cannot do more. Guilt that we are implicated by this filthy society of which we're trying to repair. Certainly at Amnesty International, our work really could be a matter of somebody else's life or death. And in the face of that kind of responsibility, how could we ever rest? I spent a great deal of time reminding Amnesty activists and volunteers that an exhausted activist was an ineffective agent for change. That living a healthy life sufficient to keep us energized and inspired was itself a gift to the victims of human rights violations, and that a world not worth experiencing in all its glory was not a world worth saving. Certainly I was always struck by the report of a medical doctor who had been imprisoned in one of the Nazis' concentration camps, and who, while there, had done much good for his fellow prisoners under, of course, extreme duress. And after he was released, he was asked how he had managed to survive. And he replied, "My rule was very simple. It was myself first, and then myself again, and then myself a third time, and then all the others." So these are some of the pitfalls of being a rescuer: pride and anger and guilt, and they require for their repair a sense of balance and a larger purpose, a quiet at the center, a deep appreciation of the gracious and the grand. And one thing more, often, as I say, of course, despite our best efforts, we fail to win a newer world. And at times like that, we look for reminders that despite its flaws, creation contains enormous gifts, and that despite our limitations, if we live with tenderness and care, making others glad and claiming the gladness in ourselves, then our very presence in the world can be a manifestation of creation's grace. I suspect that no question was more frequently asked of me during my years at Amnesty than this one. How can you hear day after day about terrible atrocities like torture and genocide and still manage to go on? But the truly important question was not how I survived the stories, hearing the stories, but how the targets of human rights crimes survived their ordeals. And the answer that I received from one after another of them, when I would ask them, was that they fastened on to something. It could be their family, or their comrades, or their ideals, or the cause in which they believed. They fastened on to something and held on, certain in the faith that eventually their suffering would end. And sometimes it did, and sometimes it didn't. But
Either way, the imperative was to hold on. And be we rescuer or rescued, that is always the imperative for those who seek to tame the forces of injustice, to hold on, to sustain the vision, to keep the faith. So all of this is a long-winded way of thanking the School of Social Service Administration for having kept that kind of faith for 100 years and counting. And the other thing that the social service sector and the human rights community have in common is a recognition that our fate and the fates of every other person around the globe are intimately connected. That's an insight that our country has appeared to lose these past 8 years, and that loss did enormous damage to the cause of human rights. We need to understand how that happened and what we now have the opportunity to do about it. And that's what I want to talk with you about for the remainder of my time. Those of you who read The New Yorker will be familiar with the little squibs that appear occasionally at the bottom of the columns, and one of my favorites was this one. Important notice. If you are one of the hundreds of parachuting enthusiasts who bought our book, Skydiving Made Easy, please make the following correction. On page 8, line 7, the words state zip code should have read pull ripcord. Now, when I read that little notice in the New Yorker, I naturally conjured up an image of hundreds of people falling through the air desperately shouting their zip codes. And on another level, that notice reminds us that the consequences of even one little mistake can be catastrophic. And if that's true of just one, imagine what can happen with dozens. I don't have to convince this audience that the United States has made an enormous number of mistakes over the last few years, and as with the parachuting example, the consequences have been deadly. And one of the most unfortunate consequences has been that a nation that had been widely respected in the world and looked to for both moral and political leadership has come to be regarded as a rogue elephant. Between the year 2000 and 2006, the favorability rating of the United States has fallen from 62% to 39% in France, from 78% to 37% in Germany, from 83% to 46% in our closest European ally, Great Britain, to say nothing of 61% to 30% in Indonesia, and 52% to a pathetic 12% in our closest Muslim ally, Turkey. And the result is not only that the world has become more dangerous for Americans, the result is that even when we're right, Iran, for example, may very well have nefarious motives in the development of nuclear energy. Nobody believes us. And even when our moral leadership is desperately needed, as in Darfur, nobody trusts us enough to follow. Now, we all hope, of course, that the election of our new president will make an enormous difference in America's reputation. Having lived in Chicago myself many years ago, I know that you can't help but, in general, share my skepticism about politicians. In general. I'm now from Massachusetts, where a while back a Democratic senator got on statewide radio and proclaimed in loud and fervent tones, "The Republican octopus is spreading its testicles across the entire Commonwealth." Skepticism in general, but we all know that Barack is different. But we also know that even a great president can't solve everything, especially not those things that are deeply embedded in the country's personality. And the truth is that much as we might like to blame all of our problems on George Bush, he was simply exploiting a predilection that reaches way back to the beginnings of America, a predilection which we need to be conscious of in order to resist. Let me tell you what I mean. Perhaps because both of their names begin with P, Americans have a hard time distinguishing the Pilgrims from the Puritans. Now, the Pilgrims, see, even I have, The Pilgrims were the ones, of course, who arrived at Plymouth Rock, or at least allegedly so. They didn't really arrive at Plymouth Rock, but allegedly they did so in 1620 to escape religious persecution. The Puritans came 10 years later under the leadership of Governor John Winthrop, and they came to the New World not because they were being persecuted. They came in order to found a more perfect religious utopia, a more pure community, a New Jerusalem. What Governor John Winthrop, no doubt conveniently providing Ronald Reagan a speech metaphor, called a city set on a hill. And both the city part and the hill part were equally important to the Puritans. The Massachusetts Bay Colony, yes, was to be a city of great virtue. The minutes of an early New England town meeting catch this spirit perfectly. We passed 3 resolutions, the minutes read, voted first that the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. Voted second that the earth is given to the saints. Voted third that we are the saints. But what good was sainthood? What good was sainthood if nobody knew about your saintliness? So the hill part of the city set on a hill was equally important. That city had to be set not in a valley where no one could see it, but on a hill where it was visible to everybody. The eyes of all people are upon us, Winthrop declared, and if we succeed, all people shall say of later plantations, Lord, Lord, make ours like that of New England. So you see, from the very beginning, this country saw itself as a model for the less enlightened to emulate. And of course, who were the least enlightened people around? Cotton Mather believed that the devil had intentionally placed the Indians on a continent that was uninhabited by Christians so that the gospel of Jesus Christ could never reach their ears. But, he then asserted, thanks be to God, the Puritans arrived and outfoxed old Beelzebub. Indians, England, the rest of Europe, the whole known world would benefit from following the Puritans' example. And that sense of moral mission has never left us. And so when George W. Bush declared in his second inaugural that freedom is written in the human heart and that it is the policy of the United States to support the growth of democracy in every nation and culture with the ultimate goal of ending tyranny in our world, he was hearkening back to an age-old American assumption embodied, among other places, in the Declaration of Independence, a document that proclaimed the value of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, not just for Americans, not just for colonialists, not just for the British, not just for British subjects, but for all mankind, as they put it then. And indeed, that assumption is reflected every time a preacher or a politician refers to the United States, as they so often do, as the greatest country on the face of the earth. So, this predilection to believe in America's exceptional qualities and transforming mission is an old one. And like so many mythical constructs, it's not without its partial basis in truth. I was in Geneva, Switzerland, the day before the election, November 3rd, Monday, November 3rd. I was speaking to a group of parliamentarians from about 60 countries around the world. And naturally, one after another of them took the opportunity, faced as they were with that rare thing, an American, to denounce the United States' policies the past few years and to challenging me, of all people, to defend them. And finally, I said to them, ladies and gentlemen, you've chosen the wrong American to ask to defend American policy. Few Americans have been as critical of it as I have been. But I will say to you, sir, from Syria, and you, sir, from Benin, and you, ma'am, from Singapore, that if you had been as publicly critical of your president or prime minister as I have been of mine, not a single one of you would be here with us today. For all its faults, the U.S. has been a model for much of the world when it comes to fundamental freedoms. But no surprise to you to say that for the past 8 years we've gotten off track by indulging the narrow, particularistic inclinations of the American character, and in that process done enormous damage to our human rights reputation. Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, extraordinary renditions. Ironically enough, all of them in the name of defending freedom and human rights. For the past 8 years, we have acted as if the future of the world depends upon only one nation and that the opinions of the rest of the world carried virtually no weight. It was as if we believed that God did not place America on a landmass protected by two great oceans, as if we believed that God did not allow us to survive a blood-wrenching civil war. God did not lead us across the prairies, guide us to two great victories in world wars, lend us a hand to defeat communism. God did not do all this to see us end up subject to the whims and wheezes of some effete, snivelly-nosed, French-sounding, hygienically challenged Dutch bureaucrat in The Hague. In 2000, Condoleezza Rice declared in an essay in Foreign Affairs magazine, when she was then the foreign policy advisor to candidate Bush, she declared this: foreign policy in a Republican administration will proceed from the firm ground of the national interest and not from the interests. Now, this is the important phrase. Not from the interests of an illusory international community. So it's no wonder that it mattered so little to the Bush administration what the international community thought. Such a community didn't even exist. It was an illusion, a figment of some damn liberal's imagination. So, how do we restore America's credibility and not, incidentally, its reputation as a leader of human rights? Well, at the most fundamental level, what we need to do is to begin to honor our global neighbors once again. Indeed, if we fail to do that, we have no hope of reclaiming the mantle of human rights leadership, because, after all, universal human rights have no meaning without the imprimatur of the international community. The only power that the concept of human rights carries, the only power of the meaning of human rights, is the power that is derived from the fact that more than one country has agreed to them. Some years ago, for example, the state of South Carolina banned video poker. And one citizen of the state said to the New York Times, "They're taking away our damn rights. It's practically communist not to be able to play video poker." But I'm sorry, no video poker may be an inconvenience, but there is as yet no international consensus that playing it is a fundamental right. So here are 5 initiatives that the new administration can undertake quickly without expending huge sums of money or political capital. It can, for example, announce the closure of the prison camp at Guantanamo Bay at a date certain. John McCain also favored shutting down Gitmo, and though it may take some time to figure out how best to process or prosecute the remaining prisoners, setting a date to close the camp will send a powerful message of intention, just as President-elect Obama's commitment to get out of Iraq in a specified period of time has done. So that's the first thing. Secondly, the President can extend the ban on torture to the intelligence services because Congress put a lid on the use of torture, but President Bush indicated that that prohibition would not apply to the intelligence services, only to the military. So President Obama should make clear that the ban does apply to the intelligence services as well. The new president should send the Secretary of State to Sudan. The U.S. has denounced the mass atrocities in Darfur, but failed to mount a concerted effort to stop them. The African Union UN peacekeeping force still lacks sufficient troops. It's only looking for 26,000. It's managed to gather something like 15,000. It's only looking for 24 helicopters. At the time of the tsunami in Indonesia, we sent 76 helicopters to Indonesia. So making Khartoum the new Secretary of State's first foreign destination and having him, or as recent reports might have it, her, deliver a firm message of resolve will begin to reverse that drift. And appointing a high-level envoy, such as Colin Powell, to shepherd a renewed initiative to bring peace to Darfur, that too would reinforce the seriousness with which the new president takes resolving that crisis. A fourth thing the new president can do, quite simply, is to re-sign the International Criminal Court Treaty. In one of the most bizarre actions of the Bush presidency, the U.S. sought to remove President Clinton's signature from the treaty establishing the court. Now, there is no international legal recognition that you can remove a signature, but the Bush administration did that nonetheless. And so, by withdrawing the letter of withdrawal and committing the U.S. to send representatives to the 2009 review conference that will consider amendments to the court's statutes, the new administration can seek adjustments to the ICC statutes that would make eventual ratification of the treaty and U.S. membership in the court more likely. And finally, small thing, but an important thing in terms of sending signals to the international community, the U.S. should reappoint American observers to the U.S. Human Rights Council. Now, to the UN Human Rights Council. Now, the UN Human Rights Council has been a disappointment to everyone, and the U.S. has chosen not to stand for election to it. But last June, the Bush administration went so far as even to remove observers from the council's meetings, and such petty detachment gains us nothing and comes across as pure hubris, and the new president should reverse that decision. In the long run, of course, there are many other things that we can do to signal that we're back in the international ball game. We could ratify the Convention on the Rights of the Child or the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, for example. We could pay our back dues to the United Nations. Most importantly, we could apologize to the international community for the debacle in Iraq. But whatever we do, we need to draw from a different well of American history than the one I described to you a few minutes ago. For, you see, there is more to the American tradition than the bullying hubris we've seen for the past 8 years. There is also a tradition of generosity and hospitality, of rescue and liberation, of decency and virtue. We sometimes forget this. That part of the tradition is manifest, for example, in a Roger Williams who thought that the early colonists, what a quaint idea, ought to actually pay the Indians for the land that they had appropriated. It's manifest in a Judge Samuel Sewall, who was one of the jurors at the Salem witchcraft trials, and who 5 years after the trials stood up in church, tears coming down his eyes, his cheeks, and publicly apologized for his role in that horrible incident. It's manifest, this other spirit, in the Bill of Rights. It's manifest in a William Lloyd Garrison and a Lydia Maria Child demanding an end to slavery. It's manifest in an Elizabeth Cady Stanton expressing outrage when the World Anti-Slavery Society in London denied delegate status to women. It's manifest in a Sojourner Truth leading slaves to freedom. It's manifest in a Lincoln offering his adversaries, weeks before the end of the Civil War, malice toward none and charity toward all. It's certainly manifest in Jane Addams founding the Settlement House movement and being the first American woman to receive the Nobel Peace Prize. It's manifest in the defeat of fascism, in Roosevelt's Four Freedoms, in Truman's support of the United Nations, in Eleanor Roosevelt's vision of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's manifest in Dwight Eisenhower's 1958 State of the Union address, in which he said, the only answer to a regime that wages total Cold War is to wage total warm peace. It's manifest in the civil rights movement. It's manifest in the resistance that has been shown to those pinched souls like Lou Dobbs, who would not be where they are today if their immigrant ancestors had been treated the way they propose to treat the latest generation of new Americans. It's manifest in the courage of those lawyers, most of them, let's remember, military lawyers who have defended prisoners at Guantanamo, often at the expense of their careers, and those judges who have dealt a power-hungry president one legal defeat after another. Draw upon this part of the American tradition, and we will begin to repair our reputation rapidly. For human rights, you see, emerge out of the common misery of humankind. And they emerge out of the sad but gentle truth that the angel of death perches on the shoulders of every single one of us waiting for the moment of delivery. And in the face of that truth, human rights give voice to our deepest yearnings about how to live together, about what it is to be a civilized people, yearnings for things like a reconciliation of adversaries, yearnings for things like a better life for our children, a fair distribution of the earth's abundance. And what the world most admires about America, and this is still true, I tell you this from having visited over 70 countries in every part of the world, not our military power or our economic might or even our entrepreneurial spirit or even, I might say, our educational institutions, great as they are. What the world most admires is the vision that this country at its best seeks to embody of a society that respects minorities, that protects the innocent, that guarantees due process even to the most evil and heinous person among us, and that wields its power with grace and patience. We've seen America at its worst. We've seen America draw upon that one well of our history and our tradition. And what the world wants, and what I think a majority of Americans now want, is to return to the best of the American tradition. John Winthrop had great hopes for his New Jerusalem, but he knew that the realization of those hopes turned on just one thing, that the colony would not just be a model for others, a city set on a hill, not just a model, but a model of decency, a model of virtue. And if it failed to be that, he said, in one of the great phrases of that tradition, if we fail to be a model of decency and virtue, then surely our prayers shall turn into curses, and we shall perish out of that good land whither we passed over this vast C. Time now to try decency and virtue. Time now to try the best of the American tradition. And I thank you and the School of Social Service Administration for having embodied that spirit as you have for now 100 admirable years. Thank you.
Time for questions?
And I might say that you need not limit your questions to what I talked about, because as one trained in the ministry, I was trained down the street to speak authoritatively to any subject, whether I know anything about it or not. So ask me anything. Yes?
I'm assuming that Amnesty International, by virtue of its name, has different constituent countries or representatives from different countries.
Yes.
And so the question that occurs to me is, do those representatives, does Amnesty International ever investigate situations in countries for which it has representatives?
Oh, absolutely. Yes. So Amnesty has formal national sections, it calls them, in about 55 countries, and it has membership in over 100 countries, members in over 100 countries. And Amnesty regularly investigates its own countries. And indeed, we in Amnesty USA regularly made reports on the United States' own human rights violations. Interestingly enough, when Amnesty was first founded, and it took about 30 years to change this policy, when Amnesty was first founded, it invoked restrictions on what it called work on own country, because it didn't want Amnesty to be perceived as political within any particular national context, and it didn't want Amnesty's findings to be criticized as reflecting some particular political agenda or persuasion. But eventually, the organization saw the light and realized that who was better placed to know what was going on in a particular country than the Amnesty folks themselves in that country. So yes, many of the groundbreaking reports have been done by Amnesty sections on their own countries.
So there have been reports on the United States?
Many of them. Many of them, yeah. Certainly on the death penalty, yes, but on many, many other subjects. Absolutely. Yes, that's an example. Shortly before I left, one of the very interesting reports that we did was on the fact that women on Native American reservations were often caught in a catch-22 when it came to sexual assault, because the sexual assaults on many Native American reservations are committed by non-Native Americans from outside the reservations. And when that happens, the Native American authorities refuse to deal with the case because it falls outside their jurisdiction, since it's a non-Native American committing the crime or allegedly committing the crime. And the federal authorities don't deal with the matter because it takes place on a Native American reservation, which is under the jurisdiction of the Native American authorities. Perfect catch-22. So Amnesty issued quite a comprehensive report on that, which is beginning to make changes in the law in terms of authority for making responsibility for those kinds of decisions. That's just one example of the type of thing. Yes?
You said you should try and look into a different well of American history. What advice do you have for individuals that wish to do that? What individuals do you think?
Well, the first thing they should do is join Amnesty International, or at least I used to be paid to say that when people would ask me that question. I mean, you know, I think that the reality is that one of the riches of this country is the wide variety of voluntary associations that exist, of voluntary social change organizations, the so-called NGOs, non-governmental organizations, civil society. And it's very hard to, as we've seen in this last election, it took a tremendous team to make this change. It's very hard to do something as an individual. So I always encourage people, it doesn't have to be Amnesty, but depending upon someone's own interests, there are an enormous number of organizations with which to affiliate, and thanks to the electronic revolution, it's easier to do than ever before because you don't even have to move from your comfortable chair to be an important player in many of these activities. So, I mean, it depends, of course, what your particular interests or convictions are, but I think that that's a very, very important place to start. Yes? Well, now that's a question the dean will answer. She didn't hear it, but I'll repeat it for you, and then you'll answer it. Given the challenges, human rights challenges, particularly here in Chicago, but not limited to Chicago, what are the particular challenges and agenda that SSA faces and will be facing over the next 100 years? Simple question for you.
In 5 minutes.
All right, the author of the question. Thank you very much. And it is a large question, but in fact, in the meeting just prior to this, we discussed just that question, the commitment that SSA has in partnership with the Human Rights Program at the University of Chicago to infuse and provide opportunities for students to develop the knowledge and skills to do the kind of important work that we've just heard about, as well as for our faculty to come together to identify just what are the educational programs our students should have to prepare them to move into a global world that we'll have, that we have now and will have in the next 100 years.
Anything else? Yes, sir. Right. Did you all hear the question? Okay. I won't try to repeat it entirely, but the fundamental question is asking me to comment on framing some domestic issues such as the rights of children, could have also referred to health care and other issues in a rights framework in a domestic context as opposed to the international context. And this is a very important question and a very groundbreaking area of human rights work. So let me respond with just a bit of detail on this. And there's also some very interesting new findings, including about policymakers here in Illinois that I'll give you a reference to that some of you may want to follow up with. And Susan, you'll be interested in this if you haven't, if you're not aware of it. First, let me just put this in context by saying that in part because most international human rights organizations emerged out of a European context. Certainly, Amnesty did out of the United Kingdom, and others out of France. The understanding of rights initially, for most of those organizations, was a fairly traditional one, having to do with the tried and true civil and political rights: the right to free speech, the right not to be tortured, right to a fair trial, and so on and so forth. Gradually emergent over the last 10 years has been a growing appreciation for the importance of social and economic rights, the right to education, to health care, to a job opportunity, and so on. But of course, as the implication of your question correctly is, within the United States, framing these issues in a rights context as opposed to an instrumental context has not been very popular. And we can have a long conversation about what it is in American history that has resulted in that, but that is just the fact. However, quite interestingly, there had been some emerging signs that this may be changing. And one of the most interesting is around this issue of health care and whether health care is or is not a right. There were only two questions in the presidential debates asked of the two candidates that had anything to do with rights. One of them had to do with Darfur, and the other was, is health care a right or a privilege? And Obama immediately said it was a right. I don't know what McCain said, but it certainly wasn't an affirmation of health care as a right. Now, Obama's doing that was actually rather remarkable. Because in fact, in his policy papers, Physicians for Human Rights did an analysis of them. In his policy papers, he basically doesn't refer to health care as a right. It's all far more an instrument. And way, way back, I think it's on page 11 of his paper on health care, there is a reference to it being a right. But faced with this question, he owned that and responded to it quite forthrightly. Now, that is a remarkable development because if you think back 10 years to when the Clinton debacle around health care took place, the idea that health care was a right or that debate was framed in terms of right was nowhere on the agenda. But an organization called Opportunity Agenda, which does, among other things, surveys, you may know of them, Susan, or be related to in some way, that does surveys of, among other things, of opinions about Americans' opinions on various issues, did in 2007 an opinion on the general public's opinions with regard to the application of an international human rights framework to domestic issues, and just 2 weeks ago completed or published a study on the opinions of policymakers on the same questions in the states of Illinois and California, taken as two important and leading states. Quite interesting. Overwhelmingly, the public is way ahead of the policymakers on this question. That's not in and of itself surprising. But even the policymakers, I can't remember the exact figure, but it's a very significant figure. Even the policymakers agree well more than a majority that health care is a right. And where these opinions have evolved over the last few years is a clear recognition of social and civil and political rights, a recognition that education is a right. That's not surprising given the public education system. The country long ago, at least de facto, acknowledged that education was a right in as much as every child has a right, in effect, to go to school. But now, a significant majority of both the general public and policymakers in those two critical states agree that health care is a right. They don't agree that economic security is a right. And there is still considerable resistance to framing economic security in rights language. And that will come next, and who knows how long that will be. But there is movement on this issue of health care. And I think given how high the president-elect has placed health care on his own domestic agenda, with the asterisk about the economic situation that we all know, I think it will be very interesting to watch that debate whenever it comes to fruition and the extent to which it is going to be framed in rights terminology. And I can say that most human rights organizations are now on board with doing that. And Amnesty itself, for example, which resisted this for years and years, has now its latest international campaign is a campaign on poverty and the right to economic security. It's not going to resonate very much here in the U.S. given these findings, but it is an important development.
Yes. Is one of the reasons that so much of the human rights history found its base in Europe the fact that we in the United States have a written constitution that we're accustomed to look to for sources of rights, and therefore we don't know where else to look if we're going to look for a source of rights? Is that part of the...
I think that that's a worthy speculation. Yes, I think that that's part of it. I think also that, I mean, after all, let's remember the contemporary framework of universal rights emerged post-World War II. And in that context, Europe was looking for transnational values in a way that the United States, having, quote, won the war, didn't quite feel the need to do. And as Europe integrated more and more, this notion of universal values and universal rights were more and more compatible with the European experience. We know from the decisions of our own courts that, in general, the courts have been resistant to citations of international rights because of the U.S. Constitution. We know that the U.S. regularly takes exceptions and reservations to various treaties that it does ratify, and there are only a few that we have ratified, but often even within those treaties there are reservations that restrict the interpretation to ones that are consistent with the U.S. court's interpretations of the U.S. Constitution. So, yes, I mean, this is a big problem. But interestingly enough, even here, and Opportunity Agenda has also just published a fascinating survey, not just of the federal courts, but of state courts in terms of their citations of international human rights law in their various decisions. And this is just growing rapidly. And when you have a situation in which Sandra Day O'Connor becomes the champion of taking international human rights law into account, as she in fact did in the last few years on the court and has been even more outspoken post-court, that is a remarkable experience. That is a remarkable development. And Anthony Kennedy, swing justice, in part because he goes to Salzburg every year for the legal clinics, has been the key vote over and over citing international law. And so this development too is, I think, a very positive one. But I think it's very interesting what you speculate. Is there one last question, then we'll go have some refreshment? Yes.
For those of us that are students in the room, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about your experiences prior to Amnesty International and how that led you to become the executive.
Sure. Well, I did not take by any means a traditional path to human rights leadership. And essentially, I mean, I became executive director of Amnesty because I knew a member of the search committee who was a very stubborn man and who kept throwing my name back in the pile when everybody else on the search committee threw it out because I was unqualified for the position. So that was just a pure matter of luck. And finally, the committee was just exhausted by Phil and said, well, all right, God damn it, we'll keep his name in, we'll talk to him, but he's not qualified for the job. So don't take my path. But there essentially, of course, you either choose a legal or a non-legal path to human rights engagement, and either one of them are quite worthy, and you can talk to Susan, the director of the program, about different options. I mean, my own background, as I said, is as a Unitarian Universalist minister. That faith tradition, of course, is one which not only emphasizes social justice, but also our global fealties, our loyalties, not just to one national culture or context, but to the globe. And so I had been in that context as president of the denomination deeply involved in human rights issues and in various forms of leadership from the standpoint of the religious community at that point. But that is not by any means a traditional way of going about it.
Well, let's give it next to Bill Schultz.